Hello everyone and welcome to another YouTube video. In this video we'll go over the game between Leinier Dominguez and Maxime Vachier-Lagrave, which was played at the Sinquefield Cup today in St. Louis in the US. The Sinquefield Cup is one of the strongest chess tournaments in the world. It features a lot of top players such as Fabiano Caruana, Wesley So, MVL, Richard Rapport, and a lot of the American players. Anyway, so let's jump right in and have a look at the game. So Leinier opened things up with the move 1e4, MVL played c5, and Leinier played knight f3. And MVL stays true to his guns. He plays the Sicilian Najdorf, which is what he always plays. So d4, takes, knight f6, knight c3, a6. And here we have the starting position of the Najdorf. There's a lot of things White can do. White can play bishop g5, this is one of the main moves. He can, make a bunch of random pawn moves. H3 is a move, G3 is a move, F3 is a move. Name a move that's been played. A3 is a move, Bishop E2, even Bishop D2 has been played by Lucas Van Forest. One of the most puzzling moves, I would say, against the Najdorf. But Dominguez chose one of the main lines, which is the move Bishop E3. Now here, Black has a couple options again. The main move is E5. Black can also play Knight G4, hitting the bishop. Or e6, which transposes into what's called a Scheveningen variation. It's not Scheveningen, no, Scheveningen. But MVL plays e5, the main line, hitting the knight. So Dominguez drops back to b3, and MVL plays bishop e6, f3, and bishop e7. Now, there's a lot of ways Black can play this variation. He can also choose to play a move like h5, stopping a potential g4 from White. But MVL played bishop e7, queen e2, castles. This is perhaps the main line, you could say. Long castle, knight bd7. So White goes g4, expanding on the king side. So he can start up an attack later on. But White also wants to go g5, hitting this knight to fight for the d5 square. So MVL goes b5, gaining space on the queen side. Dominguez goes g5. And here for a very long time the main move was always b4. However, this gets very, very theoretical. White can do a couple of things. White can either take on f6, Black takes here, Black's hitting the queen, so White has to recapture, Black recaptures. But, and play generally continues with knight a5, rook c8, knight c6, here, take. And White can try to claim a small advantage after queen to a3, because he has the two bishops, potentially a queenside majority, so endgames are generally very good for him. And his pawn on d6 is a bit weak, but in return Black can create counterplay on the queenside after rook c6, followed by rook to c8. But another option for White is playing the move knight e2, and this gets pretty messy. Black responds by moving his knight back. White goes f4, gaining space. Black goes a5, and White goes f5. Now this bishop seems trapped, which it kind of is. You don't really want to take here. White just recaptures and has a huge advantage. White's going to go knight g3, bishop c4. And the bishop does a good job defending the king. And White can, storm the castle with these pawns over there on the king side. Instead of that, Black usually plays the move a4. And this gets pretty nuts. Like, White can choose to take. And in this position, White has a good chance for an advantage, but White can also play the move knight d4. And this is where things get out of control. Black plays b3. Now you cannot take the bishop because Black takes here, and you cannot stop this pawn from promoting. So White plays king b1, and here Black takes on d4. White recaptures. Takes on c2. White recaptures, and Black plays bishop e3. White takes, and White plays knight a3, closing down the a file. And there's a bunch of theory here, but just to illustrate why the move b4 is not really played anymore, there's a whole lot of theory Black has to remember, and he has to know all those lines often to make a draw. So instead of that, MVL played the move knight h5. It's actually a variation I've played a lot of times. It's less theoretical. So Dominguez played the move king b1, which is always a very useful move in a Sicilian. So let's say move bishop takes g5 comes later, it's not with a check. And the king is just a bit safer here. Black played knight b6, fighting for the d5 square, and Dominguez played the move knight a5. Now, with this move, let's say black plays a move like g6, white's idea is to go knight c6, hit the queen, and actually white wins a piece here, but you can take the knight, but also this pawn on d6 is hanging. So white wants to hop into c6, which is why MVL played the move rook c8, stopping that, guarding the square. And Dominguez plays knight d5. And this might seem like a mistake at first glance, because black can take, white recaptures and black takes, which looks like a blunder from black. But after white takes, now this knight on a5 is hanging, and black has won a pawn. But in return, white has the bishop pair, and especially white has a firm grip over the light squares. So Dominguez goes c4, trying to soften up the pawns on the queen side, and MVL goes knight f4. So with that, Dominguez is forced to take, black recaptures. So now the black pawns are doubled, but he's gotten rid of the dark squared bishop of white. Black often wants to go rook c5 and hitting this pawn, which is why Dominguez plays the move h4. Guarding the pawn, and he has the potential of going like h5 and opening up lines towards the black king on the king side. So MVL plays queen a4, getting out of this pin. Now black is not hanging a pawn, you cannot take here because of check, king a1 and queen c1. And you get checkmated on the back rank because these pawns are blocking the escape route for the king. So instead of that, Dominguez plays bishop d3, guarding this square, and his bishop is looking towards the king side. So MVL takes. If he doesn't, then his position is really bad after white takes, because black doesn't really have chance for an attack, and then the queen side just collapses. So he takes on c4, and here Dominguez comes up with a very impressive sequence. He goes queen e4, threatening checkmate on h7. Now know that you cannot take the bishop, because that hangs your queen. So black's only move is the move g6. If black plays f5, you take en croissant, and then you take on h7. So he plays g6, and now Dominguez went bishop c2, hitting the queen. Now note that the queen is hit, and also the bishop on e7. White could not take the bishop here, because his own bishop was hanging. So he plays bishop c2, and he's hitting the queen and the bishop on d7. So black has two moves. So he can go with the queen at d7, or with the queen to e8. And believe it or not, but here MVL might already have made the decisive mistake. He plays the move queen d7, which looks very logical, and actually he played it after 1 minute of thought. But the only move to stay in the game is actually move queen e8, which looks very weird, because you get yourself in this pin, right? So white can play rook d1, and your only move is rook c7, guarding the bishop. You cannot, like, if you go bishop d8, I just take here, and you lose a rook, so you just lose the game. So he goes rook c7, guarding the bishop. And now white's most logical move is h5, going for the attack. And here black has to play d5 to try to distract the white queen. Now if you take, black goes queen b5, offering the queen trade, which gives him time to mobilize his own pieces and also start generating threats towards the white king. So white should play the move queen e5, hitting the rook. Now this looks pretty bad for black, because the rook is hit, and if you would move it, white takes here, and it seems like white's attack is just devastating. But black has the move queen c6, guarding the rook, and if you take here, black does not recapture with the h-pawn, because you get checkmated with the rook. You got to keep that h-file close, so black plays f takes g6. And here, somehow, black is holding everything together. If white plays bishop takes g6, this does not work, because black takes with the queen with check. So white does not have time to take the rook on c7. So white can play the move rook takes h7, which black has to take. White can follow it up with a check, king g8, but if you keep checking, then the king just walks away, because everything is guarded. But white can play the move rook h6, threatening checkmate on g6. And now black has the move bishop f6, which looks pretty insane. But he's up a rook, so he can afford to give some material back. if you take on g6, I go bishop g7, blocking the check. And if you take the queen, now I take your queen, and you're going to be down a rook, so you're just lost. So some pretty insane variations. I'm sure both players were considering this during the game. After bishop f6, white should actually take. Black has to take with the rook, and white can throw in bishop takes g6 to try to create more threats. But black can actually just take the bishop, and white is forced to give a check, give another check. You do not go with the king here because of checkmate, but you go with the king to f8, and white has to keep giving checks with the rook. If you give a check here, then rook g8, and you're down a rook, there's no more checks, so you're just lost. But rook h8, white makes a draw, because in case black goes rook g8, white has to move queen takes f4, giving a check. Now you cannot go rook f7 because of queen b8, and white's gonna pick up the rook and have a devastating attack. Black's king is still very weak. So instead, black should go king g7, and now the game ends in a draw after queen e5, king f8, queen f4 with a perpetual. So pretty insane stuff, but I wonder what both players were calculating during the game. But once again, MVL did play the move queen e7 quite quickly. Once again, queen e8 does feel unnatural because you get yourself in this pin. But after queen d7, Dominguez followed up with h5. You want to open up lines towards the enemy king. Now you cannot take the pawn on g5 because white takes here, and you never really want to take it with the h pawn because white goes queen d4, threatening checkmate. And if you go f6, now I can take here. Your entire king side is getting ripped apart, and especially you're getting completely destroyed on all the light squares. Now you can also not take with the pawn, because then white goes queen d5 and picks up the bishop on g5, and white's winning. So instead of that, MVL played queen e6, offering a queen trade, and now Dominguez plays the move h takes g6. So you might be wondering, like, black has time to trade the queens now, right? But if black takes, white's going to take here first. Black recaptures, and now you take an e4. And this endgame, even though black's up a pawn, is pretty unpleasant for black, because black's king is still pretty weak. If you go rook g7, I have to move g6, because you cannot take because of bishop d5 check, and if you move over the king, you get checkmated. So you would have to give back the exchange, but this endgame should be lost, because white is not even forced to take right away. Play something like rook d4 later, and then hit this pawn, and take the rook at the right moment. So instead of that, MVL's in a tough spot. He also can recapture with the f pawn, which is what he wants to do, because that hangs the queen. So he takes with the h pawn. Now here queen d4 can be met with queen e5, blocking queen h8, and here black's doing very well. But instead of that, Dominguez takes on f4. So MVL goes queen e5, offering the queen trade, but Dominguez has no interest. He goes queen h4 and wants to go for checkmate on h7. So MVL goes queen g7, and here Dominguez showed some pretty impressive calculation. Now, to go for checkmate, you want to open up lines towards the enemy king, but this queen is covering all the entry squares for the queen. So what should white do? White should try to go for a triple stack on the h file. But the question is, which rook should you play? Should you go rook h2 and rook h1? Or should you go rook d2 and move the rook to h2? And Dominguez chooses to play rook d2, which is actually the right move. And we'll see shortly why. After MVL plays rook c5, hitting the pawn, you actually cannot play rook h2. Because here, black does not take with the bishop on g5, because of check, take. You do not get checkmated because you have king g7 and king f6. And your king is safe, but you lose the rook, unfortunately. But instead of that, black has the move rook takes g5, and now the bishop is still guarding the rook. So after check, this variation is actually winning for black, because there's no checkmate and white just down a couple pawns. So by taking this pawn, black has freed up this f6 square for his king. So white plays the move f4, guarding the pawn. And now the most logical move for black would be to play rook b8. So now you do not play rook h2 because that allows checkmate. Oops. Yeah, I know this is difficult for low rated players because this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 squares away, but always try to have that full board vision. But instead white plays the move b3. And now black can take, white recaptures, and the bishop here is doing a pretty good job of holding the queen side together. And now after black takes and rook a5, threatening stuff on a1. Once again, yeah, the queen can move that far. White can play rook b2. And the advantage of having played rook d2 and rook b2 is that you keep your rook on the h-file. Because if we compare the variations, let's do it real quick. If white were to play rook h2, then black can go rook c5, f4, rook b8. White plays b3, takes. And now, after black takes on rook a5, you would have to move this rook away from the h-file, which is a concession, because your queen and rook are doing a good job of keeping this queen tied to the defense of the king. So that's why rook d2 was the better move. So once again, some pretty impressive calculation. Dominguez also spent like 23 minutes here. So rook d2 was played, rook f5, f4. Now MVL should probably have tried rook b8, the variation that I just showed, but he played the move f6. But this feels a bit suicidal, because he's opening up a lot of squares around his king. So Dominguez goes rook h2, bring the rook in the action. MVL takes, and here the very strong move, queen to e1. Actually a backwards move. Those are sometimes difficult to spot, but white is threatening to go queen e6 and go for checkmate. But also, if black plays a move like queen f6 to cover that, white can always play, white can play something like rook h6, and you cannot defend the g6 pawn properly. So MVL plays bishop f6. Now, if you check, you go queen f7, and rook h8 can be taken by the bishop, so that's his point. But instead of that, Dominguez plays the calm move rook h6, hitting the pawn on g6. Black has no way to defend it properly, so MVL just goes queen b7. Now black is threatening checkmate, even though it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 squares away, pay attention. But Dominguez plays the move, queen e6. And black is just lost. You cannot go king g7, because that runs into checkmate. If you block with the rook, there's queen e8. King g7 runs into checkmate on h8. If you block with the rook again, white's going to take here, and if you block, this is checkmate because the bishop is pinned. And after king g7, there's rook takes g6, checkmate. So a very nice game by Dominguez, who is really establishing himself among the top players. He's in the lead right now with 3 out of 4, or +2, as a lot of chess players like to say, having won 2 games and not having lost any. So yeah, very nice game by him. I hope you all liked the video. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't already. Make sure to hit that like button, really helps me out. And also, yeah, leave a comment below. Let me know what you'd like to see next in future videos. And so yeah, thank you guys for hanging out, and I'll see you all in the next one.